There are 17 episodes here today on Anime Retrospect, as got me covered just to cover a review for this video for a change. So we're going to a journey back to the 80s as well, because you know, the good old times as well. So what have our hobbies is, or whatever our passion is, of what I want to come by, of how I want to make this very great, it all becomes something for a change. Well, today we're going to be reviewing Ulysses 31. Ulysses 31 is actually a French-Japanese co-production anime that was premiered on October 10th, 1981, which is basically how it was the perfect example of anime series that were made by the Japanese studio, made in conjunction with a French studio, is that this particularly goes as well. So there's 26 episodes on this series as well. And yes, this is actually like something I haven't thought of doing. So let's go with the story like this. So it starts off in the 31st century in space. Ulysses and his son Telemachus on his birthday, along with his faithful robot named Nono, which is basically how they were transported to Ulysses' space cruiser ship, which is called the Odysseus, or whatever you want to pronounce it, because that's Ulysses' space cruiser ship as well. When they were departed for Earth, but that wasn't too long until they were basically got caught in surrounding in space of how this happens, until something flashing from above kidnapped Ulysses' son Telemachus, as well as they were letting him down to where the prisoners were, until he met the two blue alien. One is named, the girl named Yumi, and her brother, what's her brother's name in the, or because it's kind of a hard name to like pronounce in the Ulysses 31 series. Oh yeah, now I remember. Yumi's brother is named Numenor. Yep, those are the alien siblings from the planet Zotra as well. When they were spying on the cult, when they were worshipping this giant robot that resembles the Cyclops in this one. Well, technically, despite that, this is basically a futuristic version of Homer's Odysseus Greek poem story, but we'll get to that. Anyway, so particularly of how when Ulysses had to fight off the giant robot Cyclops in order to save his son Telemachus along with the alien siblings, Yumi and Numenor, along with the help of the robot companion Nono in that one, particularly, because whenever the credibility what they got as well, he has to defeat the Cyclops robot in that with his fusion sword of a beam saber sword gun hybrid, what Ulysses had, and his shield to protect himself as well, no matter how much he can fight the monsters that are in space as well, of how this progresses in this particular series, of what this has a lot to do for accordingly as well. When Ulysses saved his son Telemachus just in time, this how it wasn't long until they were angered by the gods of Olympus when they were when they were sentencing him to travel those stars, which angers the gods of Olympus. After they angered the gods of Olympus in this particular series as well. So they must travel upon the stars through the Olympus as well, and which is going to take them a long way. In order to how Ulysses wanted to came back to Earth when he wants to see his wife Penelope, to prevent her from getting to be with another greedy prince like another man as well. Even because technically he still has got the chance, particularly. It's a very thing of how this makes it a lot more different than any other has gone from. No man has ever seen of how this goes, hasn't it? Speaking of which, and there's some parts he sees the Circe witch goddess maids, the people that turn into pigs, as well as he fights the Minotaur or thing, though. What Ulysses has to fight, though. And he basically travels through time, basically, of how to the old Greek time, when because he's basically from the 31st century like future, when he sees his old past self in Greek time as well. That's a nice little trivia to this particularly, hasn't it? So that's the story of how this goes. The story is very well written. Despite that, this is actually like a futuristic version, like a reboot future version of Homer's Greek poem story, Odysseus, but in a more space opera, like sci-fi feel for a particular series like Ulysses 31, as how this particularly goes of how they wanted to do this. Creative work. Stories like this, of how this goes and stand a test of time for the satisfactory results. Despite of how this given into the point outs and standouts of how this has been going. Especially when they need a little bit of history from the little Greek mythology, and with a little hint of sci-fi space opera feel as well. Although I haven't been a history buff yet, but no offense to history buffs out there as well, because the Greek mythology is the old topic, particularly before it was depicted in cartoons. They were depicted in like dusty old books that no one reads because they're watching television in the 80s as well. I mean, the characters are basically how it's well made in the production. During the production for the Ulysses 31, with the help of like Japanese animators on here, and even the mech design was recently done by Shoji Kawamori in that one, because he's famously known for his other works of anime, which you get the picture. Which, ironically though, for the interesting facts about Ulysses 31, because this is basically how this goes, as how the first half of the series was originally like, I believe this was done by, that'll be a trivia to this as well. Yeah. Despite that, this was the contrived feel of how it's been accomplished, of how exciting ways of this goes as well. Made in conjunction with French producer named Jean Chalopin, who later worked on The Mysterious Cities of Gold as well. Despite that, this was the first anime that is in co-production, which is in like a French-Japanese co-production. And yes, this was originally came out in France as in the 80s on there, when it was made by Deke Entertainment, which is made in conjunction with a Japanese studio, TMS Entertainment, formerly known as Tokyo Movie Shinsha, as how this particularly goes as well. So for the production on the Ulysses 31, there is also the production of how they have worked time when Japanese animators and producers worked very hard on this whenever the production of how they made for Ulysses 31, particularly of how they wanted to come by for this, and the reason why of how they want to do this as well. And yes, this became an international hit all across the country. Besides Japan, you have France, and you also have in the UK in 1985, and in the US, most likely in the US in 1986 as well. Part of the satisfactory results, more different from Saturday morning values as how some of how this goes compared to most of the other cartoons of the 80s. Despite that, this anime is a French-Japanese co-production as well. And even the music, however, this was originally composed for the Japanese music composers as well, for the Japanese dub of the anime. Like this one, Ulysses 31, is that, because it goes by the name Uchu Densetsu Ulysses 31, because, you know, it's basically like the name from this translation of the Japanese pronunciation as how if you ever grew up in Japan as well. Despite that, this series also was aired in other countries, such as Italy on Odeon television as well. And even there is a line of merchandise, including these action figures, that they look similar to these Kenner figures. And even there's any piece of merchandise the fans would know of how the merchandise of Ulysses 31 was made in support of the show, just despite of how the fans have for the nostalgia values, as how this could be the nostalgia of the 80s alongside with other ones such as the Transformers, Visionaries, and Thundercats as well in general. Well, unlike most 80s cartoons of its kind, but I think this what makes it interesting about Ulysses 31 is that the theme song, the theme music, which is the most, has its cheesiest lyrics on here, and it was originally composed by Shuki Levy and Chaim Saban, who recently worked on countless numbers of cartoons and TV shows and movies from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and to the 20th century, particularly of how what Chaim Saban and Shuki Levy had a lot to do for as well. And even basically how this series got a nostalgia 80s popularity for fans who ever grew up watching it. Whether you grew up in the UK or in the US during the 80s, this would help you go in for the thing for the series like Ulysses 31 for the production values as well. Yeah, this was beloved in Europe as well. Despite that, this series was the first French-Japanese co-production, because I think it was the last from the creator who died during the production is Tadao Nagahama, who recently worked on The Rose of Versailles. Yep. Yeah, he died during the production of Ulysses 31. And even that, despite that, and also Deke had English stuff for other anime later on in the 90s, which you get the picture though, accordingly as well. Ironically though is that this is basically in a futuristic designs of how most of them, how they worked for how the basis of the stories, of how despite that this was adapted from the story, the Greek poem Odysseus as well, they wanted to do something more interesting and more unique of how they wanted to make the story, Homer's Odysseus Greek poem tale, to be setting in a futuristic like setting as well. And even there is also the Ulysses 31 pilot included also as well, and this particularly has never been unreleased. Technically though is that it was basically looked unreleased, and it was never appealed for the home video market in the public, as if it was particularly. Despite that, this series had a lot of merchandise, and even also had a complete series set in Region 2 in the UK, and later in Australia by Madman Entertainment as well. But there is also the Region 1 DVD of this particular series of Ulysses 31 as well, according to the fact as well of how I can know. Despite the US DVD release of Ulysses 31 only has like 4 episodes. And yes, I still have this copy of that as well. And it's basically how it's giving the things of how you want to expect for how they made the production for a series like Ulysses 31, is that this was basically more unique and more generistic thing of how it's basically how it's been all for its own sake. And one thing is that this series has not been aired on television as it was used to. Well, it was back as it was to the 80s as well. For anyone who is basically how it was to our time, if it was to our parents' generation, as how, despite that, Ulysses 31 has its basically capable manner of its own of getting to the thing as well. Well, the story. So for overall in Ulysses 31, if you ever watch this kind of series, if you want to binge watch on something just to get for the nostalgia feel that you grew up watching this back in the 80s, and you ever want to give this one a watch as well, I highly recommend you to watch Ulysses 31 for anyone who is either young and old that remember Ulysses 31. And particularly as well, kind of basically the thing of how you would, how it's given into the recommendations as well. For the recommendations on here, this will be part for your recommendations if you ever love watching a series that is particularly with the which is a French-Japanese co-production series as well. Despite that, this series has given in the thing of how this makes it interesting and very good for a day is that Ulysses 31 is the perfect example of the first co-production anime in the 80s, up until the later anime came up later on in the 90s and as well in the 20th century as well, which there's a lot of them, of the majority of its kind as well. But ironically though is that what makes it interesting about Ulysses 31 is that I really love it, because despite that this series has basically released on like Japanese VHS releases basically, well I think that's only in Japan as well. And for the thing that basically Ulysses 31 basically have how, well technically though is that it's basically, well, of how some of these episodes have been taking the source from the source material from Homer's Odysseus Greek tale, with how they use the combination of Greek mythology with a bit of space opera, sci-fi feel of how they want to do this. For an idea like Ulysses 31 is that yet another kind of minority of how they were basically, and it was very basically how I've been baffled for a major French-Japanese co-production work like this series of how this goes. And it's a real thing of how it seems to work, of how what Europe had a lot for the airing of this beloved series should go. It's fantastic, really. It was a labor of how this goes, and in played it as simple as saying these perfect examples as how this goes for many, many days as well. And with the only thing for a particular series like that as well as from a capable as well. And for the for the thing about this one as well, for a good series for a change, of how despite that this series of how there's only 26 episodes on there, but only 12 episodes were shown on Japanese television broadcast in 1988, accordingly, as well. Because some of them were edited out from, like, 26 episodes when after it was premiered from other countries, which this goes to France, United Kingdom, and most likely the United States of America as well. My score for Ulysses 31, I'm gonna give it a 10 out of 10 as well. Yeah, that's okay. Well, on behalf of this as well, if you have never seen Ulysses 31, like if you want to binge watch on something like this, get it, because I highly recommend you. If you have it on DVD as well, because this show has basically considered one of those that receiving like a major cult following. Not necessarily old shows in general, old anime or older 80s cartoons in general, but one of those that have particularly receiving like a major cult following of a day, for a day as well, as how I come by for this. For anyone who's young and old as well. From what I understand why. Yeah. And for the thing for that is that one of the basic example of here, what I talk about here on this show, on the Anime Retrospect, is basically how I come across basically a story of how they use the combination use of Greek mythology and sci-fi as well. Whenever they made, for the idea of how they made Ulysses 31 as well, of how they made this, for the sheer beauty as well. Because this becomes a cult series now, and this plays it all over the world for fans as well. So that's why. So that's going to be it for my review on Ulysses 31 for today here on Anime Retrospect for today, you guys. Thank you for watching, but before we go, here's what I'm going to say for this one. Despite that I have reviewed about 347 reviews in the past, Ulysses 31 takes the cake, though, because I wanted to come by for reviewing a series as well. And also for the English dub on Ulysses 31 also, not, if I'm not mistaken, not to mention, this is basically an English dub over a Japanese anime made in conjunction with a French studio as well. And the reason why I love the series a lot as well. But I do love the fact that it's becoming a good subject for cosplayers also as well. For anyone who grew up watching the show accordingly as well. Hope subscribe for content. My anime plan, link in the description down below. You share this video on your Twitter, Facebook, if you have a Twitter, Facebook account, and all social media. Smack the like button if you enjoy this video. Be sure to click on the subscribe button. Be sure to subscribe to my channel if you haven't subscribed to my channel, especially if you're new to my channel. Smack the notifications bell button. Be sure to get notified also as well for more latest updates. Anime Planet link will be in the description down below. Patreon, the link will be in the description down below if you want to check it out at your leisure at this point as well. Smack the like button if you enjoy this video. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below on Ulysses 31, because I wanted to talk about a series like this, of how I wanted to come by for this as well, for the whole, anyone who has the nostalgia feel as well. Well, on behalf of this, once we get, that's pretty much it for my review on Ulysses 31 here on Anime Retrospect. Everything will get back to normal is basically of how I wanted to come by a series of an OVA that I wanted to revisit, of how it started the otaku cultural feel as well, and the whole great example of the 80s as well, that I wanted to talk about, that I haven't thought of revisiting for a long time, especially on these old anime ones that I have been talking about, that I mentioned as well. So everything will be back to normal by revisiting an anime OVA that I wanted to talk about, that I haven't done a redo review for a very long time, as how I wanted to come by for this, of how I want to come get the feel of how you would know, especially for a basic, simple of how I wanted to come by for this, along with other ones to honor of its anniversary, as a revisiting from the past as well, especially of how I come across a story on here as well. It's more as well, including differences from the manga, to revisiting a certain anime OVA that came out in 1986. Just basically how I wanted to come back as a revisiting, like I haven't done one for a long time. And for some reason is that it'll get me in the case as how I wanted to revisit a certain old anime OVA that I want to revisit, that I haven't thought of for a very long time, of how I can come by for this, which will get my word for it. Till next time.